Again, I put the question to you. As the dive supervisor, did you prepare a dive plan and carry out a risk assessment?
Yes, I did. Yes. Yes, I did.
But when the police asked you for these documents, you were unable to produce them.
No. No. No.
You've told us that you consider yourself an experienced diver, but it was your neglect of basic safety procedures that was directly responsible for this tragedy. Your trainees on that day trusted you implicitly. They placed their safety in your hands.
I ask you to examine your conscience. Did you adequately discharge your duty of care?
A mistake that cost one trainee his life.
In recent years, HSE have investigated a significant number of serious diving incidents, some involving fatalities that have occurred during recreational dives or whilst trainees were under instruction. Diving can be tremendously enjoyable, but it must be remembered that it is also inherently hazardous. As diving instructors, you have the privilege of introducing your trainees to the wonders of the underwater world, but you must do this safely. You have a duty of care to your trainees and are responsible for their health, safety and welfare at all times whilst they're under training. Train them well, and the techniques and skills you pass on will enable them to progress their diving careers safely. Train them badly and there may be tragic results.
Throughout this film, we'll be looking at the roles and responsibilities of diving instructors and their support teams, the importance of project plans and risk assessments, and some simulations to show typical situations that have led to fatal accidents and how these could have been avoided. Two documents provide the essential information needed to make a diving plan and risk assessment. These are the Diving at Work Regulations 1997 Approved Code of Practice for Recreational Diving Projects, usually referred to as the Recreational ACOP, and the Scuba Industry Trades Association Recreational Diving Projects Risk Assessment Guide. Many of the recreational diving agencies were consulted during the preparation of these important documents. The Recreational ACOP applies principally to diving at work situations, but all instructors, regardless of their affiliation or at work status, have a duty of care to trainees under their control. So for anyone involved in dive training, the Recreational ACOP contains a lot of useful guidance. When making a risk assessment, you first need to identify potential hazards, and who or what is likely to be affected by those hazards. You then need to consider the risks associated with those hazards, and what measures you will take to control them. This process will reduce the possibility of anyone being harmed during the diving project. It's important that you make and keep a written record of the steps you've taken.
The day of the accident, the police, the knock on the door, the police came to home. So I literally came in to a situation, and Mike telling me that there had been an accident and that Julia had drowned. I think from a totally personal point of view, identifying Julia is probably the hardest thing I will ever have to do. And that, I think, is the one thing that will always stay with me.
In the course of their duties, HSE diving inspectors attend coroner's courts, fatal accident investigations, criminal and civil court proceedings. In every case, the project plan and risk assessment are very closely scrutinised by the court. Well-prepared project plans and risk assessments demonstrate that you have thought about the hazards and their associated risks and show what steps you've taken to control them. When writing your project plan and risk assessment, remember that they may be produced in a court of law as evidence.
The initial stages of diver training are very important. Trainees have a lot to learn: the physics of diving, the physiological effects on the body, how the equipment works, and how to use it safely.
As an instructor, you must make sure that those new to diving are trained in the safest possible environment. Open water may not always be the best option, as environmental conditions are harder to predict. A more sensible choice may be to use an inland dive site such as here at Capernwray.
Inland centres are often based on old quarries or gravel pits, but the infrastructure is designed for dive instruction. They have easy access for vehicles, with car parks and outdoor lighting. User-friendly facilities may include reception areas, provision of refreshments, changing rooms, classrooms,
Would anyone like to guess what the water temperature in Capernwray is today? About 15.
and workshops for the maintenance and repair of dive equipment. The water is not prone to tides, currents or waves like the open sea, so it presents a much more benign environment. Diving at these centres is still a rewarding and enjoyable experience. At some sites, aquatic life can be observed, and divers can explore various underwater attractions that have been placed on the bottom. When instructing trainees, you should always look for a site that allows for easy access and egress of the water, with areas that are relatively shallow and flat-bottomed for training purposes. The staff at the surface should have a good line of sight onto the water and be able to respond quickly if any problems arise. Formal emergency procedures should be in place, and oxygen and first aid equipment should be available on site. There should be access to telephones, and arrangements should be in place with local doctors and hospitals.
We've seen how safety should be built into the facilities of an inland dive site. Another factor in the favour of inland dive sites is that their more controlled environment makes it easier to prepare a dive plan and a risk assessment. There are fewer unpredictables, and the information on the water depths and their other physical factors are readily available. We're about to see a group of trainees preparing for a dive. Note how the instructor emphasises the safety principles that are the basis of the dive plan and the risk assessment.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm dive supervisor today and the instructor in charge of today's activities. As is always the case, there'll be a second instructor with us who's a rescue diver. That's Phil here, who's the rescue diver. Phil's job is to look after me in the event that I have a problem, but he can also obviously help out with you guys as well. We also have a surface support person, which is Dave here, okay? And Dave's job is to look after things for us on the surface and to deal with any problems that may occur, okay? As you're people involved in a recreational diving project and as trainees, and because I'm a professional dive instructor, I'm responsible for your personal health and safety. The same responsibility would apply to anyone during diver training, whether it's an at-work situation or not. During the earlier classroom session, we looked at the ACOP and the Scuba Industries Trade Association documents that we use for planning and assessing risks. We believe that this process is a very positive step and that should form part of every diving project because it increases our safety and makes us more efficient at training in the water. Okay, this is the project plan for today's dive as laid out by the approved code of practice. Capernwray as a dive site is one that I'm certainly very familiar with. I've dived there quite a few times. But obviously, we always complete a thorough dive plan and risk assessment just before we dive to make sure that we're comfortable with what we're doing. That obviously allows me to check and see if there's any significant changes that might impact on how I organise it and how I can safely conduct the dive. The area that we're going to be using is this area here, which is a shallow water training area, and specifically we're going to be using a platform that we've placed here at 6 metres to do the skills. I've listed the names of the instructors and support personnel on my risk assessment already. I've listed things including the depth that we're going to be working at, the estimated time that we're going to have to complete the exercise, any tables or decompression-based obligations which obviously won't occur during this dive but could have possibly occur, and any other factors that might influence our dive plan. Specifically, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at buoyancy control skills involving the use of a dry suit. In order to do that, we're going to do a number of exercises. The first one is a fin pivot, and the sign for a fin pivot is one of these. We'll be doing a hover, and the sign is one of these. And we'll be using a descent line on the end of the platform to practice a controlled descent. Now obviously here at Capernwray we have a relatively benign diving environment in that we're not massively influenced by tides or currents, but we still have factors that we need to be careful of when we're diving here. And amongst these are obviously things like the general weather conditions and the conditions down in the water. Okay. More specifically, in terms of risks that we have involved in today's diving, I've laid these out according to the CETA guidelines on my risk assessment and noted them down, but I just want to go through a few points to make sure that everyone understands. The first point is obviously we're at a dive site here where the surfaces are relatively level outside, but there is loose stones and there is uneven ground. We're going to be carrying heavy equipment, so it's very, very important that we take care to avoid the risk of slips, trips and falls. Similarly, scuba gear, I'm sure we've all worn it before, is heavy stuff, okay? And we need to make sure that we correctly lift and handle it. Now obviously during the training that we practiced in confined water, we looked at the buddy system and how we're going to get our buddy to help us to get this heavy gear on. If any of you are unsure about quite how to deal with heavy gear and how to lift it correctly, please feel free to ask me and we'll show you again. We have other risks. For example, in order to dive underwater, as you're all aware, we have to use quite a lot of equipment. And the equipment is life support equipment, so it's obviously very, very important that we avoid any malfunctions. If we were to have a problem with, say, a demand valve, obviously it would lead to fairly serious potential consequences underwater. So in order to minimise that risk, what we do is we make sure that it's properly maintained. We have a workshop here, Breathe Easy, and in Breathe Easy you'll see that they have maintenance logs for all the equipment we use here. And whenever anything is done to it, it's noted to make sure that the equipment is safe and works efficiently for you so you enjoy your diving. We have some natural hazards possibly. We're okay today, it's the middle of summer and the water's quite warm, but we have an additional hazard involved with that because we're involved in dry suit training. Dry suit training involves putting on exposure suits and warm gear in order to keep us warm in the water. Obviously because we have a high air temperature today, there is a risk of heat exhaustion or getting too hot in the suit. Now in order to minimise that, what we'll suggest is that you put on the suits last, as the last thing you do. So we'll get all the gear together, we'll get everything ready, get our project plan together, agree to go in, and then we'll go in, suit up and go in as a last thing. In the middle of winter, if you come here, obviously the water temperature is right down in the low temperatures, and obviously there, very cold water has its own set of risks that we'd need to make sure that we take note of in order to deal with. And things that we could do to deal with cold water would involve things like keeping dive time short and making sure that we're wearing the correct exposure protection.
Capernwray and similar inland sites provide ideal conditions for diver training, but coastal waters and the open sea still remain a popular choice.
The interest in diving came from a holiday in Australia, a family holiday in Australia. My husband had done a diving course, and going to the Barrier Reef was a natural, diving was something that we were going to do. And that's really how she became interested in diving. And when she came home from Australia, she would be about 16, decided that diving was something that she would like to pursue. Was in the process of applying for university, and actually had, about a week after Julia died, there were some acceptances for universities came through. I miss Julia's noise. Julia was a very noisy person within the house. We all miss her smile. But I think she was a very kind and very loving lady. You would always get a hug off Julia. And I think those are the things that I miss.
Diving in open water can be a tremendously rewarding experience. With a proper training and correct procedures, it can also be relatively safe. It's up to you as an instructor to make sure the dive plan and risk assessment take account of the trainee's limitations, and that you take great care in choosing a suitable dive site. We'll now see a computer simulation based on typical incidents where trainee divers have lost their lives.
The dive was made from a boat into open water. The group was comprised of 5 trainee divers, divided into one buddy pair and a group of 3, along with the dive supervisor and a rescue diver. The seabed was at a depth of 20 metres directly below the boat, but it sloped away steeply and was covered in silt. The divers descended, but as soon as they neared and then rested on the gradient, the silt was disturbed, severely reducing visibility. The group of 3 became concerned, and they were taken up to the surface by the dive supervisor. The other buddy pair stayed with the rescue diver, who did not have the qualifications or experience for this job. They attempted to complete the lessons, but as the visibility got worse, they decided to abandon the dive. The rescue diver hung on to the 2 trainees and tried to get them up, but they were overweighted. They tried to fin up, but this only disturbed more silt, further reducing visibility. The rescue diver was using both hands to hold on to the trainees, which meant that he couldn't try to get more air into their suits. They began to slip further and further down the slope. One of the trainees inflated his buoyancy compensation device, which lifted him back to the surface, a very dangerous procedure and one he was lucky to survive. At this point, the rescue diver lost contact with the other trainee and decided to make his way to the surface, hoping that the trainee would do the same. However, the trainee, overweighted and unable to control his buoyancy, continued to descend. His body was later found at the bottom of the slope, over 50 metres below the surface.
This tragedy was foreseeable and could have been avoided. The group should not have been split up, leaving 2 of the trainees with a relatively inexperienced instructor. A shot line should have been dropped to help them find their way back when things started to go wrong. But the main point here is that the dive should never have gone ahead at this location. These inexperienced divers were taken to a sloping seabed with reduced visibility and with the potential of a greater depth than was necessary. If the instructors had properly prepared their dive plan and risk assessment, they would have realised that the risks at this site were too great.
This accident highlights the unpredictable conditions found in open water when compared to an inland site. If this dive had taken place at a good inland site, the trainees would have received instruction in shallower water and on a flat sandy bed. If an accident did occur, it would be easier to deal with, as a good site would have qualified staff and emergency facilities available. In open water, the risks can be controlled by a sensible choice of site and a carefully prepared dive plan and risk assessment. It's important to stick to the plan once it's made. If you decide, for example, to move to a different location, then everything needs to be reassessed. This is exactly the kind of situation that can lead to a serious incident, as we'll see in the following simulation. There were 7 divers in the group, led by a supervisor and a rescue diver. The trainees were of mixed abilities. One had trouble controlling their buoyancy. Another wasn't confident and had asked to be buddied with the rescue diver. The surface support stayed on shore, where they had a good view of the dive site. The supervisor had made a dive plan, but when the conditions in the enclosed waters proved too difficult, he decided to abandon the planned dive and take the party out to a wreck further along the coast. The supervisor failed to take the group to the surface and brief them on the change of plan. Instead, he swam into open water with the group following him. After swimming for about 20 minutes, some members of the group were getting very tired. At this point, the group was approached by 2 other divers, who signalled to the supervisor that one of them was having trouble. The supervisor took the 2 divers to the surface and decided they needed to return to shore, so they set off swimming on the surface without first communicating with the rest of the group. Underwater, the rescue diver had not seen the supervisor's surface with the 2 strangers, but realising that some of the group were now low on air, he tried to get the party together and up to the surface. At the surface, he saw the supervisor swimming back with some divers. It was difficult for him to be certain how many because of the swell. He presumed everyone had surfaced and started to make his way back. The safety support watching from shore lost sight of the whole dive party when they swam out into the sea. It wasn't until 20 minutes later, when everyone got back to shore, that a head count revealed one of the trainees had not returned. A rescue operation was launched immediately, but the trainee was already dead. There were a number of warning signs for the supervisor, and bad decisions were made during this scenario. The group was badly set up to begin with. In particular, 2 of the trainees were very inexperienced. One had not yet mastered buoyancy control, and another was apprehensive about doing the dive at all. The dive plan and risk assessment were produced for confined water. Once the group moved into open water, the structure of the dive had changed completely, and the dive plan and risk assessment became irrelevant. What the instructor should have done was take the whole party back to shore, make his apologies and cancel the dive. Not the most popular of options, but the safest and most sensible. The supervisor should also have been aware that the less experienced trainees might not be able to manage a long swim. When the supervisor was approached by the 2 strangers, he should have got the whole party back to the surface, taken a head count, and checked everyone was okay before they set off for shore. Instead, he created a confused situation where no one realised that a trainee had been left behind until it was too late.
We've now looked at 2 simulations based on typical situations in open water which have led to fatalities. It's clear that if the same training had been carried out at a good inland site, especially for the divers in the very early stages of training, these deaths could have been avoided. Diving in open water does not always have to be dangerous. It just requires more planning. We're now going to see a group of more advanced trainee divers carrying out a dive from a boat.
Today we'll be diving using 2 very important documents. First one is the Diving at Work Regulations 1997, approved code of practice for recreational diving projects. And the second important document is the Scuba Industries Trade Association's risk assessment guidance for diving projects. Today's dive will involve carrying out a survey of a wooden wreck that sits in approximately 18 metres of water and stands about 4 metres off the seabed, and we'll be looking at the general condition of the wreck and the marine life that's associated with the wreck itself. Okay, the dive plan is we'll dive in 2 groups. Dan and Paul will be diving with Alistair as your instructor for the dive, and Tim and Andy will be diving with Malcolm as your instructor looking after you. Planned dive time will be 30 minutes. Your maximum depth for the dive is 18 metres. Okay, we'll do our usual buddy checks just before we enter the water. Entry will be from the starboard side. There's a shot down onto the wreck. So when each group is ready, you'll enter into the water, surface, give the OK signal, allow your buddy to jump in, get together as a group at the shot line, give the final OK, and then go down the shot line onto the wreck and start your task. It's almost ideal conditions for diving today. It's flat calm, so there'll be very little windage and drift. So as the boat comes up to the shot line, if you're ready to jump in, we'll just put the boat in neutral, so there'll be no problems of forward motion of the boat or from the propellers themselves. Okay, the wreck itself on the last inspection was fairly intact. It is a barge, so it does have a hold. No one is to enter into the hold because it is an overhead environment and therefore presents the problem of entrapment. And as rescue divers, you're not trained to do penetration diving at this point. Once you've completed the dive, either when you get down to your reserve air supply of 50 bars, or you've reached your maximum no stop time for this particular dive of 30 minutes, I want you to deploy your delayed decompression markers and come up and do your safety stop, 3 minutes at 5 metres. Once you're on the surface, stay together as a group. If you're near the descent line down onto the wreck, I just want you to move slightly away from it to give the boat plenty of room to manoeuvre so it doesn't get the line caught in its propeller. Once the boat comes alongside, it will go into neutral, swim across to the ladder, hand up any loose equipment that you have, and then climb up the ladder one at a time with all your equipment in place, remembering that people still in the water shouldn't be directly underneath the ladder just in case someone slips and falls back in. Okay, just prior to entering the water, we'll do our buddy checks. I'll be acting as the supervisor today, so we'll get your air contents in, and I'll check that again when you come out, remembering that you're working to a reserve air supply of 50 bars on this particular dive. The location of the oxygen and the first aid kit is up in the bow of the vessel. Alistair, Malcolm and myself are all trained in first aid should that be required.
We've seen that diving in open water can be safe providing the dives are planned according to the Recreational Approved Code of Practice and the Scuba Industries Training Association guidelines. Ignore these and the risks of an accident may be increased. The results of a diving fatality affect more than the diver that is killed. It has an impact on everyone that knew them, in particular their family.
An awful lot of people miss Julia. And I think Julia touched an awful lot of people's lives. I miss the buzz around the house. When Kate's home, it's very, very hard not to see Julia next to her. The first Christmas that after, well, within weeks obviously after the accident, it was Christmas. And it was a huge void not seeing them both together. And because Julia drowned in Scotland, we had to a longer period of time. So we had, I think it was 10 days before a funeral could be set in place. And again, then you go into a situation, which is part of it you blot out, part of it you still do. I still things I don't remember. People will sometimes say things. So you, as I said, you just go into this, I suppose a nightmare situation. Julia drowned in the November 99, and we actually went in the March 2001 for the first session at the court. So there was a year plus. It was something that I very much wanted to almost hasten to get there, to do it. It's a bit like I find you go through things in stages. You do all the business, and then you know you've got the church service, and there's that to get over. And to me, it was another hurdle for my child to be allowed to go to 54 metres. It's a long way down. I think everybody in their own way found it extremely difficult. Everybody does things and everybody tackles things in a different way. You either get on or you throw the towel in, and there have been times when I have just thought, what is the point of carrying on? I think that anybody diving has to be qualified. I think some of the diving tuition rush through. It's all very well doing it, learning about it, answering questions, filling in a book, but that can never ever make up for experience. And I think that anybody diving, they have to have experience. It isn't enough just to have been in the classroom, been in the swimming pool and done it. You've got to build on that. That's got to be your foundation, your building block. And every time you dive, you have to build on it. And things have gone wrong because there hasn't been an adequate risk assessment, and there hasn't been a rescue there, or the rescue has been inappropriate. And I think that, shall we say, maybe we would have stood a chance and Julie would have been here today.
In this reconstruction of a dive incident, two parties of divers went out in a hard boat, which had a high freeboard. Both parties decided to dive at the same time, leaving an empty deck. The only person left on board was the skipper. After a while, the skipper saw a lone diver appear at the surface. The diver wasn't moving, and the skipper knew that something was wrong. The skipper had a difficult task maneuvering the boat alongside the unconscious diver. He then left the cabin and climbed down the dive ladder. He was able to grab the diver, but couldn't pull him out due to the weight of his dive gear. All he could do was tie the diver to the ladder and wait for some of the other divers to surface. When help did arrive, the divers and the skipper struggled to get the unconscious diver back on board. Although they eventually succeeded, he did not survive. This tragedy could have been avoided if a diver had been left on the deck to act as surface support. Ideally, the two groups should have taken it in turns to dive, in which case plenty of hands would have been left on board to help the stricken diver.
One of the things that is important when taking anybody diving is to be aware of your responsibility, your duty of care. Whether it's an individual diving with somebody, whether it's a party diving, whether it's a company. It's the duty of care, and I think duty of care is the key issue. I decided that I would think of Julia's name, the initials Julia, and I thought, right, and I want to say that anybody diving has to justify what they're doing, have thought about it. Everybody diving has to understand what they're doing very, very clearly, even if it means going back over things and back over things again. Everybody involved in a dive has to listen. Listen to what everybody has to say. Listen to themselves as well if they feel that they're uncertain, to actually say, not too sure about this, rather than going into the water. They also have to investigate. Any dive has to be, they have to investigate where they're diving and make really, really sure that it is as safe as possible. And the last one is the assessment, risk assessment. So if I look at Julia's name, justify, to understand, everybody to listen, to investigate a site, and to make sure that it's jolly well assessed for risk assessment. And I think if people can do things like that, it may well just prevent another tragedy. And that's what, at the end of the day, it is. It's a tragedy.
Recreational diving should be a safe and enjoyable experience. The reconstructions have shown how quickly a fun pastime can turn into a nightmare if the correct safety procedures are not in place, and the terrible consequences that can follow. These scenarios have highlighted 3 key lessons for dive supervisors. Choose a suitable dive site, one that matches the abilities of the trainees. Use the recreational ACOP and CETA proformas to prepare a dive plan and risk assessment for that site. And stick to the dive plan. If you change the site of the dive, then the plan and risk assessment need to be remade.
Recreational diving is all about the thrill of exploring a new underwater world. As a diving instructor, following the advice in this film should help you to reduce and control the risks and ensure that more people experience enjoyable and safe diving.
It has seemed to me, when friends meet to hold a public service to pay tribute to one of their number who has died, that without words to that effect ever being said, they are drawing a circle around that friend, speaking in turn, one after the other, joining themselves together anew. They keep what they know of her intact, as if by words expressed they might turn their friendship into magic, the magic that now so clearly it had been. And my young lady was magic. Julia's friends from school came on the actual day of her 18th birthday, which was actually 3 days after she had drowned.